My name is David Flynn. I'm the Assistant Town Planning Director. I'm here this afternoon to explain the purpose of today's public hearing. It is a proposed amendment to Chapter 322, which is the zoning ordinance of the Town Code. The amendments relate to basically fences, walls, retaining walls, and berms. The Planning Department is recommending that the Town Board amend the ordinance as advertised for a number of reasons. With respect to the fences, the purpose of the ordinance is not to change the regulations, but to make the wording easier to understand for the people who use the zoning ordinance, including the public. I would just say, as an example, there are situations where people put up a fence in violation of the corner clearance triangle because they didn't know that they couldn't put a 4-foot fence in that location. So the purpose of changing the wording around was to make it easier for people to follow the rules. The second part of the recommendation deals with retaining walls, and that's primarily to codify the practice of the different departments and how they handle retaining walls, or how they've been handling permits and zoning for retaining walls for about 5 to 10 years. The only provision that is new is the one that requires that there be a setback of the wall to the property line. And the purpose of that requirement is to protect the value of people who live next to people who build retaining walls. Sometimes what happens is, with the increase in affluence in our town, people can build retaining walls where they formerly couldn't afford to, and they'll spend $10, $20, $40, $50,000 in their backyards to eliminate slopes and make more of it level and usable. And what happens is if this person is higher than the neighbor may end up looking at a 6-foot wall with a 4 or 6-foot fence on the top, and it hurts their aesthetics, it hurts their property values. Sometimes it hurts their privacy. So the purpose of this provision is to make the setback proportional to the height. The second part about that is that there have been situations in the town where someone would build the wall and then couldn't afford to fix it. There are situations in hilly areas like in San Remo where a wall was built and 20 years later it starts to lean toward the downhill neighbor. The downhill person is the one who's threatened, physically, and the uphill person can't afford to fix it. So the idea of this is to have the retaining walls, like I said, set back so that if they do fail, and one of the things that they taught us in engineering in college is that everything fails sooner or later. So, so when they fail, the downhill person will not have their own property threatened. The third part of the proposed amendment deals with berms. And this also pulls together from other parts of the town code, all in one place, the existing practices and policies of the departments who enforce and administer the parts of the code about berms. Basically, it's to facilitate people who want to put up berms to protect themselves from either offensive uses or traffic in front of their homes, but to do it in a way that protects the aesthetics of the town. So it limits the height of the berm, it limits the steepness of the berm. One of the things that I would draw to your attention that we think is important from a safety standpoint that probably most people wouldn't think of, and that is that no trees that will mature that would be tall would be permitted on the berms. And the reason for this is stability. I think what most people don't realize is the dirt that exists naturally is very compact. Let's say the glaciers receded 10 to 20,000 years ago, and you get about perhaps 100 storms a year. That's a lot of rain that moves all the little particles in between the bigger particles of the soil, and they move downward to the point that the soil becomes very compact. So when roots grow in that, the possibility of wind throwing over a tree is rather small. But when someone puts a berm in their front yard on adjacent to a town highway, it's loose fill. Its density is perhaps 2/3 or less of what natural fill is. You compound that with the fact that now the tree is raised a few feet above the natural grade, and compound it again with the fact that it's sitting on the pinnacle of a ridge. You put those three factors together, and over the course of time, the likelihood of trees toppling in the wind is very high.
Was to be heard on this matter?
It's just a question. I was just wondering, Mr. Flynn, if somebody had a berm up and it was in excess of what you have on there, or if it was too close, would they be subject to changing it at this point?
The way that we look at a question like that is it lawfully non-conforming? If something was built with a permit and the permit was valid because it complied with all applicable laws, they would not be required to change it. If someone built something without a permit and it were not in compliance with the town code as it exists today, or as it existed when they built it, then they would be subject to having it changed. Actual enforcement is not handled by the planning department, but that's the principle.
Thank you. I'll move to close
Can I
the
just
meeting.
ask a question?
Yes, ma'am. And you can direct the question here, and then he'll reply.
All right, this is just a question kind of like yours. If it's determined that a retaining wall is unsafe now, would that be covered at all?
Can we stand
Yes,
there?
please.
I think the answer is similar. If the retaining wall were put up and it didn't require a permit under the existing ordinance, I believe, maybe the town attorney is actually better equipped to answer, they would not be compelled to remove it or change it. If someone built a retaining wall that needed a permit and they didn't get the permit, then they would have to bring it into compliance. I don't know if that really answers it, but that's the way the concept of non-conforming uses and structures works.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. The question is,
We really need your name for the record.
no, I can't. The question has to do with a berm that may have been put or constructed after mature trees were there. For example, there's a lot on Edgewood Avenue that recently has put a very large berm around a whole series of mature trees, and if I understand from the explanations I've heard from other folks, that it's likely that the very fact of building that berm will cause the trees to die. Does the code address putting a berm around trees that are there? Does it allow for, if the owner wanted to do that, could you
Well,
I know that's been done in the past.
Okay, I can tell you, I think I know the bird you're referring to. That's already in the courts. So, and what I think he had not stated, burns are not permitted according to that new amendment. And the right-of-way is owned by the town. So 10 feet in, one could put a berm subject to the code. Okay? I'll move to close the hearing.